Welcome to this installment of supplemental lectures provided by PNC's Concurrent Enrollment Program. My name is Alexandra Kindle, and I will share some information with you that comes out of my courses at Purdue University North Central. Today we will discuss an important topic for understanding the 1980s and the politics of our time. Ronald Reagan was a demigod to some and a devil to others, but for today we will look at his record with a critical eye. He will receive some praise and some criticism. If nothing else, the material here should provide you with some information to think about and discuss in class. Despite the fact that conservatives had a difficult time in the White House during the post-war period, they eventually came back with gusto in the 1980s. Barry Goldwater had tried to take the presidency from Lyndon Johnson in 1964, but the Democrats were able to hold on to the office. His defeat was so total, that being Goldwater's, that it took the disasters of Vietnam to pave the way for Richard Nixon. His downfall and Ford's bumbling, of course, made it unlikely that conservatives could have held on to the executive office. But Carter, in his own bumbling ways, brought the roller coaster back to the Republican Party. For some, he was a mediocre actor and a puppet for the real policymakers, while to his followers he was the great communicator and the champion of good values and limited government. No matter what his legacy at the time, he had a way of speaking that rallied people to him. He had charisma, humor, and charm. When Clint Eastwood ran for mayor of Carmel, California, he said, "What makes him think a middle-aged actor who's played with a chimp could have a future in politics?" There's the humor. As his movie career declined, he became more involved with politics. In his younger days, he had been a Democrat with liberal tendencies, maybe the effect of living through the Great Depression. But after World War II, he became a Cold War hawk trying to purge the Screen Actors Guild of communists and eventually became a Republican. First, he backed Richard Nixon in 1960 for his presidential bid, and then in 1964 he gave what was called the speech in support of Barry Goldwater. Soon he won the governorship of California, where he served 2 terms from 1967 to 1965. There he promised a reduction in taxes, lower budgets, and a limited scope of government, while also promising to stamp out social protests. California legislators, administrators, and residents ended up rejecting most of the areas that he wanted to cut in terms of spending. While in office, the state budget grew, despite his cuts in mental health, education, and other spending. During his term, his first budget was the largest in the state's history at $5 billion, and by the time he left, the budget was at a new record high of $10 billion. All in all, his record was mixed. He was unable to make the fiscal changes he promised, but his public image remained positive. He won 2 terms respectably and could have possibly won a third. In California, he was and still is famous for responding to the free speech movement erupting on college campuses. It started in Berkeley in the mid-1960s, and Reagan campaigned to, quote, clean up the mess in Berkeley, end quote. He took direct action against UC Berkeley and other UC and Cal State schools where the protests had spread. As governor, he enraged student protesters, and he responded to them by saying, quote, the state of California has no business subsidizing intellectual curiosity, end quote. He also cut university budgets by 30%, ending free education in the state of California. He expected it would make college students more responsible. Few remember that many state schools had offered tuition-free education for in-state residents. Now state schools are quite expensive. Reagan felt that if students had to pay for their educations, they might take them more seriously. I always discuss Cal State Fullerton in my lectures where I can because it's my alma mater. As a student there, my instructors witnessed the protests after Governor Reagan came to visit. I am not that old, but history always has a way of reaching into the present. So, for the election of 1980, the nation needed direction, which had not been given by the sitting president, Jimmy Carter, who you can see on the left. The Democrats could have run Ted Kennedy over Carter, but the Democratic Party made a fateful decision and stuck by its man despite his poor approval rating. Only 21% of Americans believed that Carter was an effective president. Carter was on the hook for the bad economy and international debacles. And history has given witness to the fact that the party in office during poor economic times rarely continues to win elections. Bertie Hoover can talk about that one. Carter remained on the defensive while Reagan was upbeat and decisive. He told Americans this is the greatest country in the world and that it had the talent and drive, but all we need is leadership. A statement with which most Americans would have agreed. He declared his opposition to affirmative action, busing, and promised to get quote, the government off our backs, end quote. And of course, Reagan spoke directly to working and middle-class Americans when he said in a debate with Carter, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" Most people would have answered no. Americans responded to this by giving Reagan 51% of the popular vote. The folks that voted for Reagan represented a realignment of the American electorate, at least temporarily. What does that mean? People changed parties to suit their needs because the times were different. Similar to the 1968 election that brought Mr. Nixon into office, traditionally conservative Americans voted for Ronald Reagan. These people were predominantly white and Protestant middle-class Americans who worried about communism, law and order, and paying high taxes. But new people joined the Republican Party, including Southern Democrats who disliked the Kennedy-Johnson Civil Rights Program and the so-called Reagan Democrats. While this was already a significant number of votes, the moral majority claimed it had registered 2 million new voters for the 1980 election. The Republican Party accepted the religious rights influence and called for a constitutional ban on abortion, voluntary prayer in schools, and mandatory death penalty for certain crimes. Either this would be a revolution in politics or just another, quote, landslide vote of no confidence in an incompetent administration, end quote. That was a comment from an analyst at the time. But for now, it is important to see that Reagan, as the new president, seemed to represent the needs of the American people at the time. Reagan had chosen his one-time rival, George H.W. Bush, as his vice president and brought his own unique stamp to the presidency. He was our first divorced president and had the worst church attendance of any president, yet Christians loved him. He was an immensely patriotic man, and he was able to give people a sense of hope. Reagan was good for the nation's morale after the horrors of Vietnam and the dilemmas of the 1960s and 1970s. In his inaugural address, Reagan said that the government was the cause, not the solution of the nation's problems, yet he would find as president that making government better was not as easy as it seemed from the campaign trail. Reagan and his chief advisor, James A. Baker, quickly set new government priorities: cut taxes, reduce social welfare spending, and undo the regulatory bureaucracy. These issues got Reagan elected as governor in California and as president. Let's first talk about cutting taxes. The Economic Recovery Act of 1981, sometimes abbreviated as ERDA, brought a 25% tax cut, although this really helped the rich the most. The top tax rate fell from 70% to 50%. For the poor, it fell from 14% to 11%. By this, it was hoped that the people would spend more money, now that they were paying less in taxes. Yes, people kept more of their money, but that meant the annual revenue of the federal government had been cut by $200 billion by 1986. Let's also talk about the reduction in social spending. Education was cut by 50%, or spending on education was cut by 50%. There were a lot of jokes at the time. One of the things that got cut out of many school meals because of the cuts was vegetables, and people complained. And Reagan responded that ketchup was a vegetable. There were also cuts to grants and student loans on the federal level. There is also a significant reduction in the help for the poor in terms of low-income housing. Low-income housing was cut from $32 billion in 1981 to $7 billion in 1987. And Reagan's administration also worked to close federally funded mental hospitals, which created hundreds of thousands more homeless people on the streets, but many of whom had mental illness. 75% of the budget, however, was not negotiable. What most people refer to in the current moment as entitlements were things that people really didn't want cut: Social Security, Medicare, and programs such as those. Reagan would not touch these. Reagan's budget director proposed cutting everything from food stamps to AFDC to balance out the tax cuts, but even the Congress was unwilling to go along with this. Conservative columnist George Will wrote, "Americans are conservative. What they want to conserve is the New Deal." Thus, the budget deficit increased dramatically as the cuts were not as severe as desired. There was also a significant deregulation of business at the time. Reagan broke up AT&T, giving us the many phone companies that we have today. That was a good thing. He did the same to airlines, making air travel significantly cheaper. This also happened to savings and loans, which then collapsed in the late 1980s, causing a recession. Not so good. There was a deregulation of TV, and so we saw more TV commercials than ever before. The goal of this was to reduce the, quote, excessive regulation of business by the federal agencies that impeded economic growth in the minds of conservatives. While some agencies provided services to some corporations, they also increased their costs. Various agencies protect workers' rights, ordered safety improvement in factories, and required expensive equipment to limit the release of toxic chemicals into the environment. His administration cut the budgets on regulatory agencies by 12% and shifted some responsibilities to the state governments. A few quotes about the environment from the great communicator. This is one of the areas that was deregulated. He said, trees cause more pollution than automobiles, and all, end quote, and all the waste in a year from the nuclear power plant can be stored under a desk, end quote. Some of these don't make sense out of context, but at the time, they seem to ring true with people. One of the big problems at the time, of course, is that there was an increase in spending when there was a decrease in income. If you remember the policies of the Republicans in office during the 1920s, some of this will sound familiar. Pundits often refer to it as trickle-down economics, but that term does not fit Reaganomics exactly. While Reaganomics appears to be trickle-down economics redone, it included this one additional aspect that made it different. Yes, he hoped to increase the supply of goods, he being Reagan. He hoped to increase the supply of goods by allowing corporations and the wealthy to reinvest in American productivity. This was referred to the time by Reagan supporters as supply-side economics. But without a control on spending, there was a big problem. And even though Reaganites wanted to cut social spending, President Reagan had no intention of cutting military spending. Reagan declared, defense is not a budget item, and you spend what you need. Well, with a decrease in income, this was going to be a problem. Reagan and his defense secretary Caspar Weinberger pushed through Congress a 5-year, $1.2 trillion military spending program. Reagan revived the B-1 bomber, despite that it was expensive and it had limited usefulness, as well as the continued development of the MX missile system. But the most ambitious weapons plan was the controversial Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, proposed in 1983. Popularly known as Star Wars at the time because of its science fiction-like character. SDI proposed a system of laser-equipped satellites that would detect and destroy incoming ballistic missiles carrying atomic weapons. For the same reason, some joke that Reagan should be pronounced Ray-gun. Most scientists were dubious about its effectiveness. Secretary of State George Shultz called it lunacy. Weinberger, who liked every weapon system he ever saw, dismissed the idea, and Congress, despite all these objections, approved the initial funding for the project. Let's think about the results of all this. Military spending accounted for 1/4 of all federal expenditures. The federal deficit mounted $930 billion in 1981, and then it grew to $2.8 trillion in 1989. Yet inflation was finally controlled. It had been growing all during the 1970s. In 1981, it was at 13.8%, and by 1983, it was down to 3.6%. That gives us a lot of numbers about the big picture. So we had budget deficits, but seemingly good economic times. What did that mean for ordinary Americans? The distribution of wealth shifted. During the 1980s, the rich got richer and the middle class smaller. These numbers are similar to the situation in the 1920s. We can see the wealthiest 1%, their income increased by 77%, while the middle fifth of Americans, their income went up by 4%, and if we look at the poorest fifth of America, their income fell by 9%. So because of this, some refer to supply economics as voodoo economics. While this might seem to be one of those issues left in the past, it is important to understand. Modern conservatives both idolize Reagan and decry what they see as liberal spending. Knowing the facts is important. I have tried to get information for you from nonpartisan sources. The first graphic is from the Washington Post, and the second is from the Congressional Budget Office webpage. This discussion is not an endorsement of either party or their ideas. I am just taking a chance here to look through the political battles to examine the facts. In my classes, I equally attack either side when it comes to presenting their ideas without the foundation of truth. So let's analyze the data versus the rhetoric. While conservatives discuss fiscal responsibility, their record looks a little different from the Democrats except in two areas. In World War II, the U.S. was fighting a two-front global war. In our present era, the United States racked up a lot of debt after years of the war on terror, with spending to help Americans after the recession. These are two troubled times that need further investigation. Scholars will need some time to assess Obama's policies. But for this lecture, we need to assess Reagan's policies and how they fall within this context. Here are his deficits. If you look between these two extreme periods of high deficit loads, the conservatives look little different from the liberals in terms of spending, and if not a little worse. If you look a little closer at the Congressional Budget Office graphic, Reagan's inability to cut spending and his increase in military spending led to a higher than normal deficit load. I hope that this is something you'll be able to discuss in class. Politicians wanted to get elected, so knowing what determined the difference between facts and rhetoric should be important to voters, because the politicians, they want to convince people to vote for them. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're talking about truth. And that's true on both sides. In terms of domestic policies, historians tend to focus on Reagan's economic policies, mainly because that was the bulk of his interest socially. Unlike liberals, conservatives do not advocate using the government for the benefit of social causes. Although, keep in mind, while conservatives complain about social programs and the so-called entitlements, none have dismantled Social Security, welfare, or Medicare and Medicaid for good reason. On a recent radio show, this was an NPR show, an analyst described it this way, very similar to George Will. Americans always want to cut taxes, but when asked which programs they want cut, they aren't so clear. To say this more clearly, Republicans cannot cut these so-called entitlement programs because Americans will become angry. The issues are far more complicated than portrayed on the news or in social media. Americans might not like the idea of supporting people with welfare who they might see as lazy or undeserving, but they do not want their elderly parents to get their medical assistance for nursing homes and medical care cut either. This is a thorny problem that requires people to look beyond the rhetoric of either party and ask for real change. Thus, cutting taxes without cutting spending leads to massive budget deficits under Republicans, who then complain to Democrats who follow them to cut their budgets and to quit their irresponsible spending. If you pay attention to the political battles, you will see these trends as you get older. But there is one last event that we can examine to see how Reagan handled social issues. In 1981, 13,000 members of the Air Traffic Controllers Union, PATCO, went on strike. This was one of the few unions that had voted for Reagan in 1980, and they went on strike despite prohibitions against federal employees striking. Reagan gave them 48 hours to go back to work and then began firing them as promised after they called his bluff. Since the New Deal, Democrats had heartily supported unions, and Republicans even accepted union rights to strike as a legitimate bargaining tool. This was a serious blow to the already waning union movement. Nonetheless, the revival of the economy before the 1984 election ensured his victory. Democrats ran Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro, but Americans were not ready to switch political parties yet, and were probably not ready for the possibility of a woman vice president. This is the end of part 1. Please see part 2 for Reagan's forays in foreign policy and a conclusion to this lecture.